So we're going to continue on the discussion now with our panel. Very much the same kind of dynamics of the on-demand economy. We're going to go a little bit deeper into the areas where all of these guys have, these guys and girls, I should say, have a lot of different perspective. We've got a very diverse group of people. So what I want to do first is, defining this overall opportunity is something that's always a challenge for me in writing about it and covering the market. I feel like this is the congressional subcommittee on the on-demand economy. Defining it is always, I think, the challenge. And we've heard it described in the past as collaborative consumption and the sharing economy. Samir, your report is named the sharing economy. And at BI Kelso, we brand it as the local on-demand economy, as that's close to our DNA in covering the local marketplace. But I'd like to get a sense from each of you guys as, you don't have to name it, but what's your kind of definition of the opportunity as it pertains to your perspective of what you do in work or in life or even as a consumer? What's this kind of transformative thing that's happening in the world and how do you define it? Why don't we go down the line? Bill, you can start.
Oh, great.
You want a little more time to think?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, Sarah?
Load works for me, but...
Oh, there's a button there. Sorry.
There you're on. You're on.
You're
I think you're on now.
You're on.
Takes a
Hello?
few seconds.
Testing? Okay.
There you go.
Load sounds great, but a lot of my friends call it the crowd.
Huh.
But I like load.
Sure. So the crowd, is that like, okay, as in the kind of the wisdom of the crowd and kind of crowdsourcing and all the kind of aspects of, that's interesting, okay. Let's come back to that concept too. Brendan, you have a lot of thoughts about this.
Yeah, I mean, as it pertains to my business at My Neighbor, we think of sharing as the things that you have in your attic, garage, and basement that are of value that are being underutilized. And essentially what we want to see people do is start to borrow more frequently than they do buy. And we also think that that extends to skills and services as well.
Sure.
So it's really accessing that idle capacity.
Accessing idle capacity, I think that's a good way to put it. Mary, you're looking at this from lots of interesting angles as well.
I think Mitch invited me to come because he wanted me to talk about some of the privacy elements
Absolutely.
around this. And then also, I'm very active in the VRM community. I don't know if that is an acronym that people know, but it's Vendor Relations Management. It comes out of a project at Harvard that Doc Searles did, and basically it's the counterpart to CRM, right? So the idea is that the individual would be in charge of their own data and sharing, some indication about something that they want, and then receive offers back, or that would be like a simple example of that.
Absolutely.
So, anyway, happy to talk about.
Sure.
all this.
It's interesting too when we heard Michael Yang's panel earlier, and they were talking about the supply side of all of this and the individual workers, the micro entrepreneurs, and really what's being done for them. The term, at least, vendor relation management, reminds me of one kind of gap I see in the marketplace of some sort of a CRM solution, but for the providers of on-demand services, if they're stringing together disparate things to be able to work on their scheduling and payment, and they were talking about reviews in that panel, but something that's kind of all in one, but facing the perspective of the on-demand service provider, whether they be someone that's driving for Uber and Lyft and also maybe working for HomeJoy, and something that's on their end to really tie it all together. I'm not sure if that's related to the field of vendor relations management, but
Maybe, but actually what I think of when you say that is it's better to be the provider of the pick than the gold miner.
well, that's a great point, yeah. Very interesting. Samir, you have defined this space very well in a report that some of us have in our hands probably. So what is your kind of definition of the opportunity, or how do you frame it usually?
Sure. We actually call it the sharing economy. That's what the report talks about. It's got multiple names. It's got collaborative consumption, peer-to-peer, trust economy, and of course, on-demand economy. And the way we have defined it really is it's an economy that facilitates efficient use of underutilized resources, and it's based more on access versus ownership. I know it sounds very technical, but that's kind of how it encompasses that part.
And Amanda, we just spoke for a while about a hotel tonight, but generally speaking, what are some things you would add to this front end?
Yes, well, I think of the on-demand economy actually is very
I think
different.
Amanda's off. Hold on, I think your mic is off. Tap it. Okay, well,
okay,
just speak loud. Okay, we'll move on, and hopefully you'll get rewired. You'll be live soon. Oh, there you go. Are you on?
Oh, I think it's on.
Okay.
So I guess I was to say, I think of on-demand is slightly different from sharing. I think there's a Venn diagram where they overlap completely, but I think there's a lot of on-demand activity that happens, whether that's utilizing public resources that are available that maybe don't belong to anybody, versus things that are privately owned versus things that you would actually want to share.
Mm-hmm. So, Samir, you said something interesting in terms of the accessibility rather than ownership. There's also, sometimes I've heard it mentioned as experiential types of things instead of ownership. And I think that a lot of that has been pegged on millennials because it's something that is certainly worth watching, a very large demographic and one that is increasingly cycling into the adult population of buying empowered people. So obviously these are buying patterns that are worth paying attention to. So Sarah, I have a question for you. We're lucky to have you here as a voice of a millennial generation. And a lot of people say that, on-demand is great for millennials, or crowd, I guess we can say. Do you find that to be true?
So the question is, do millennials?
Well, so usually the accusation, for lack of a better term, is it's a generation for which on-demand is they have an affinity for kind of wanting things now and being very, I don't want to say impatient, this is probably all coming out wrong. I don't mean to offend anyone that's in the millennial generation. I think that, but the kind of empowerment of the generation to kind of want things on demand. Do you find that that's actually the case for you and your peers and all of these types of services and the ability to get something so quickly kind of wherever you are? Is that something that resonates with you? And are the claims that I mentioned, are they fair?
So I'm just at the end of the millennial, so I'm barely a millennial.
I'm just at the beginning of Generation X.
Talking to the younger ones at least, I have heard a lot of people say that millennials are self-entitled
Sure.
to have all this stuff because they just grew up with it and they're used to having it readily available. I think that is the opposite because they're the ones who are the most broke and haven't been able to get jobs to have that extra cash. So being able to share stuff is so much more about resource sharing. So it's actually the opposite of self-entitlement because they don't have anything. But, as a user myself, I love this stuff and it's a fun experience to use it and I know how to use it well.
And thank you for putting that in a much less insulting way than I did. But no, Brennan, you've also talked about this a lot too in terms of a generational outlook where even baby boomers who were in the generation of like acquisition of stuff in the 80s and 90s are even now at the point of their life where they're kind of offloading lots of stuff. So even their generation, then anyone that kind of went through the housing boom, really I think was conditioned that a house is an anchor almost in terms of being more nimble in a downturn and stuff like that. So what's your kind of generational outlook?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different things, a lot of socioeconomic factors at play as well. And I think, the kind of the hangover from the Great Recession for the millennials, as you talked about, they likely had a lot of college debt. They were in a recession where it was very difficult to get work. I think they're apprehensive and should be about, conspicuous consumption, right? Like, do I need a house? Should I buy a house? Should I buy a car? Like, what do I really want to spend my time, effort, and money on? And also seeing kind of the shackles, if you will, of that ownership, especially in a recession where having a house impacted your mobility. You weren't able to sell your house. You weren't able to take that other better job. So I think there's a lot happening there. But I do tend to agree that the generation, I think about even my own generation as a Generation X, we were brought up in mostly a broadcast-based world, and the internet has really changed that to a more on-demand world. And so I see the trend around sharing started digitally. The trend around co-consumption and those things happen very much in the digital world, and I see them now just jumping over into the physical world. So the idea of sharing music started with Napster, and I recently worked in a streaming music service, and only this week did Apple actually finally embrace access over ownership in the music business. And Steve Jobs was very much against that while he was alive. But I see that trend happening now in the physical world, and it's really dominated most people's digital lives for the last 2 decades.
Interesting. Mary, any thoughts on that? Have you looked at kind of generational patterns in any of your academic work and how they differ or don't differ as consumers?
To the point about privacy, one of the stereotypes often is that kids or millennials don't care about privacy.
That is a stereotype. I've heard that a lot.
Yeah, and I think that early on when social tools started blowing up, so 2004, 2005, there were kids, and I would include college kids who were hopping online and posting photos of themselves, I don't know, drunk at a party or something. And it would come back to bite them later, and people would say, these people don't care about privacy. But, all the later research, as kids have realized, they want parent privacy, they want boss privacy. They are actually the most active in terms of using the kind of levers and bells to tune information, and they're also using services in a way that that keeps their data much more private. And the other piece in terms of how this relates back to the load stuff that you guys are talking about is, or whatever, any kind of on-demand service, is that I think actually that generation is the most tuned in to wanting their data to be under their own control.
Sure.
And so, you talk about, the people who sell the picks to the gold miners. I just spent Monday and Tuesday for my own company looking at analytics providers. Oh. And there are 15 analytics providers that I reviewed in depth. I read their privacy policies. So for us as the company, right? So they're going to provide to us, who would then provide to our users. So I'm concerned for our users, and I'm concerned for our own company data, right? And so I looked through all of the ways that those companies work, and they all want to charge me, the company person, a fee to provide an analytics service for our mobile products, but they also want to sell my customers' data out. And they're US-centric, of course, because everyone here thinks that this is completely reasonable.
Right.
But the one company that we found that is based in Europe, Countly, they're dealing with EU data laws and UK data laws, which are very different than here. And you can't do that. And so we don't particularly want our users' data spewing all over. We don't think that millennials are going to be too happy about that. And we think that that's definitely an important part of the demographic that will be using our stuff. And so we're going with the EU provider, the EU-based provider, because I do think that they really care in a way that is, much more pronounced than as you go up the generational.
Yeah, so I think they kind of get a bad rap in that respect. And what you're saying also, too, aligns with a number of other trends we're seeing, such as the rise of kind of ephemeral social sharing of media, like Snapchat, or also the fact that there's kind of a drop-off in Facebook usage for a lot of younger generations due to the desire to not want to have that digital footprint, whether it be their parents, and that's actually a very interesting notion. It's the kind of hiding it from their parents. So
one of the reasons that kids use WhatsApp is because then there's not a phone bill at the end of the month on the family plan where it shows 13,000 text messages were sent, and 5,000 of them were between you and one particular friend, and then your parents saying, who is this? And so they go and use WhatsApp because it's all hidden. And they're buying parent privacy.
Yeah. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on the millennial generation, but I want to bring this up because it relates to some data that you have, Samir, because we've been talking about millennials as consumers. Earlier in the day, I brought up the idea of also millennials as load service providers, and the kind of flexibility that it enables really, I think, resonates. Is that am I passing the gut check for the millennial accuracy?
Like I said, millennials, we're broke, so we'll take 5 jobs.
Yeah. So it's the ability to take 5 jobs and have the flexibility to tie them all together rather than like, I got to shift over here. So the kind of flexibility seems like it resonates. And Samir, you actually have a slide. We're going to go through a few of your slides throughout the session because you put out the report I mentioned. We're going to use that as a great conversation starter.
Yeah, so just, and I'll have a postcard on the outside if you are interested in accessing this report. It's available online. But if you kind of look at the way the survey was done, we went out and interviewed 1,000 surveyees, and it was more about, are you familiar with the sharing economy? What are your behaviors? What are you interested in? What is your background? And it was quite interesting as you kind of went through all the data that was given, and we have got some of the slides over here. it looked like the millennials were clearly a huge part of this equation. They were a big part. Over here it says about 38% of them are actually in the local on-demand economy. This actually is not too far from Mary Meeker came up with her report last week, and she talks about 44%. So it's certainly something which we can clearly see as growing. And as you can also see, some of the other questions that we had asked, and it may not be in the slides over here, was as service providers, where do you see yourself, of the ones who are familiar, in the next couple of years? And the answer was 51% felt that they would be part of the provider equation, which is double of what it's today. And on the consumer side, it is 72%, which is not as double. So it looks like the supply side of the equation is certainly going to be more. And I agree with the speaker where we talked about they're broke. Millennials, but there are a lot of characteristics that even Mary Meeker talked about in her report where they're open to freelancing, they have very flexible schedules, instant gratification, which is again, getting paid on a pretty fast clip as you go through these sharing economy basis. So it actually works quite well with that generation.
I think that concept will only grow or be accelerated as we see, I made this point earlier, but I'll repeat it, the on-demand gigs, for lack of a better term, move kind of up the ladder. So it's not kind of just home services or service level professions, but also architecture on demand. Or we heard from Heal earlier. That was great, a doctor on demand, and it's moved into law and other things. So I think that only increases the addressable market and the opportunities for millennials or really anyone else to have just more kind of autonomy or flexibility. And I think that supply side is one of the, bottlenecks in these marketplaces growing. So that's only going to increase the supply, it seems.
Right.
Sarah, are you doing any types of on-demand work? I thought about being an Uber driver for a while, just to see what it's like. Have you been doing anything like that?
I know.
You do a lot of interesting work.
I am a millennial, but
you do a lot of interesting work anyway.
I recently left my job paying $350,000 a year to start a company. So, I'm not a typical millennial.
Of course you're not.
I feel really bad hanging out with my friends. I'm always like, okay, I'm going to dress down. I'm not going to, rub it in their faces. But, I also started working when I was 14. And so I do listen to them, and I read a lot of research on millennials. And one thing that millennials want is they want to learn, and they want to be good at what they're doing, but they don't have management skills.
Yeah, interesting.
No one's moved. They haven't worked at enterprises. They haven't been in businesses where they have these management skills. And so they pick up an app, and they start working, but they're not good at managing their hours, and they're working 5 different jobs, and they don't have an app that's training them or teaching them these skills. And so that's the big opportunity for app developers and companies in this space, is to build in the training and the management into the app.
Yeah, interesting. I actually read about something recently that was similar to that in terms of some entry-level jobs at places like Old Navy and others. It's kind of a module where people could kind of get trained on the the ways to interview and even that product line. And it's interesting because in addition to kind of training in that situation, it also kind of indicates a level of commitment for someone that went through kind of 10 hours to learn more about this product. But that reminds me of what you're saying is some sort of tool, whether it be kind of learning or training or something else, it's something they don't teach you in school, is to skills like that. That's very interesting. So Bill, I want to give you a chance to jump in here because one of the things we're talking about is more of more immediacy for finding something. We've been talking about this all day, and it's part of this conversation as well. And one of the things that's going to displace, I've had the theory, is search. And search is great. We've known search. It's been kind of the go-to front door for the internet for the past decade or so. But what we're seeing with on-demand stuff is that search is one thing that's being displaced or at least threatened, where a traditional Google search, for example, I don't mean to slam Google, but is search term, sift through a bunch of results, click on links, and then being taken to other places, perhaps other subdirectories and things, as I mentioned earlier, to something that is, to use an extreme example of Uber, you basically press a button and you are matched with a service provider. Now, somewhere in between there is a lot of room for leeway in terms of just compressing that process. And I think that's one of the things that you guys are doing that's interesting, is making it more compressed, less friction. So tell us about what you're doing.
So we're taking the friction out of search. Google's attempting to turn to more transaction-based rather than search-based. A little button here, button there. But we think that we need to allow the user to make those decisions.
Sure.
Under, like what Doc Searles was saying, the user intent. When the user gives you their intent, there's no reason to serve them an ad. What good is that?
Right.
So with user intent like that, once we have it, we're able to tie the user directly through our search results into the opportunity to choose between 5, 6, 4, however many service providers he wants.
Right.
We allow the user and the service provider to make that choice. And decompressing search, if you will.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So from the service provider or business, from their perspective, what does it look like? Do they get a phone call, or is that channeled into what's the mode of transportation? Or sorry, the mode of communication for what they're seeing?
Well, it's transportation. It's a phone call right away because that's the most readily available information on any company online.
Go ahead, sir.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. My last job was as an SEO. So yes, it was so important for small businesses to be the top hit on Google. But now with all of these companies, it's about their relationship and their reviews. And so I was actually checking out your product and there are reviews on it.
Yes.
And so review data is going to be the most critical data. But now instead of that data going to Google and then getting data mined and then loaded, that data is just going to go directly into the company.
Exactly.
Like Uber.
Yeah.
So it's going to be about your relationship.
Exactly. It's the fact that we own the data that Google doesn't. We know who's accepting requests. We know who's making requests. And we also know who will work with that party again.
Sure.
So that information allows us to rank people from experience. Exactly what you were saying, even if you are a millennial.
So it's also interesting, and Mary, I want to bring you into this discussion because of the concept of data and trust and data security and all that stuff, or data safety. If indeed we are, it's not search anymore, it's becoming compressed. In some cases, again, I'll use the extreme example of Uber, where you're pushing a button, someone's coming to you. By compressing all those processes and reducing friction, I've also lost something in that process, which is my ability to decide and sift through reviews and all that kind of stuff.
That's right.
So if I'm not having that choice anymore, the algorithm making that choice for me better damn well be 1, good, and 2, trustworthy. So it's really a lot of these, on-demand players in the marketplaces they're creating. Such an important element that we haven't talked about much is trust. And also that they'll trust them that they'll use the data responsibly. Anything to say about that, Mary?
Well, as someone who also, I feel like I'm wearing a bunch of hats here. I've built about 10 search and discovery systems, but this is maybe prior to about 5 years ago. And in doing that, I mean, I could see how difficult it is to make algorithms that get you the right information or discover the right piece of information that you didn't know about before. It's really, really tough. So, I mean, there are a bunch of elements. There's the, are you tracking people or not? Their service is not tracking people. But then, there's this whole problem. If you're not tracking people and you don't know much about them, you just know what they put in the search box.
Sure.
How do you get them the right piece of information or the right stuff? And maybe they've solved that. I mean, I don't know because I haven't looked at their system. But I mean, there's like all these different layers of problems. But for me, one of the things that is really troubling right now is the massive kind of leaking of our data that's coming out of our phones and tablets and laptops and whatnot, and that is being kind of hoovered up by companies that we don't even have a relationship with, and then they're selling this data all over the place, and even the providers of the companies that are leaking that data are also like I was talking about, the analytics providers for mobile app companies they just explicitly say we're selling this information. In fact, on Tuesday there was a TechCrunch article that talked about some mobile company, and the way that they wrote the article was this is what the company told us, And then we went to their analytics provider and we looked it up, and they can see in almost individual user information. I mean, it's just extremely troubling in a way that, you know, everything about us in such an intimate manner is being collected, right? And then used in, you know, for all these different kind of marketing and other purposes. And so, you know, yes, I mean, you could take all that data and munge it around and create the ultimate big data platform that gave you the thing that just had a single button. But I mean, I still, you know, if that button were really right, I would be totally creeped out maybe. And if the button were wrong, I'd be like, how come you're wrong? You know, I mean, it's sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of a problem.
It's a sliding scale between relevance and collecting too much data, or it's a trade-off really, data and relevance.
And there is another question that I would ask, just kind of on a more human level, which is, do we really want to secede everything about our own ability to make decisions and decide what we want to a company? I mean, or to some algorithm somewhere. I mean, is that really what we want? I don't know.
That happens on an individual basis, very much. Now, Amanda, I want to bring you in here because I think you guys have done a great job pinpointing that kind of discovery mode where you're, you know, we talked about your algorithm and ranking factors earlier, but you know, what's your philosophy on providing, you know, these suggestions and things that are relevant to people, utilizing kind of the bare minimum amount of data and not being creepy, as people sometimes say?
Yeah, we don't. So we, to be totally transparent, only use the data that we get within the app. So if you tap on a hotel, we assume that you like it. If you watch a market, we assume that's a positive indicator of interest. If you reviewed another hotel, it's similarly. So I hadn't ever considered using data outside the app, but I do think there is an advantage to having that more personalized experience. I think if I think about the on-demand world, we're just a less planned, more in-the-moment experience. And I think when you're in the moment, searching through hundreds of results of whatever that thing is very hard. I understand there are trade-offs with privacy, and I understand that there are certainly sacrifices that you choose to make or to not make. But I'm a believer in the world where if a company, in a safe way, can, or in a, I guess, honest way, provide you a great result, I think that's fabulous. I won't talk about Google. They have their own policies, and they're very interesting. And I actually don't spend a lot of time on social media for many reasons. But that I think providing a better result is ultimately what we want, and there are certainly trade-offs between that. But I don't live in fear of how all of that marketing data is getting stolen. Maybe I'm not educated enough and I should spend more time. But I think of all the problems I have to worry about, and in the moment, I think it's really relevant and valuable, and overwhelmingly users are saying so.
Yeah, I think it probably comes down to a personal choice of how comfortable you are, and as a consumer, you have the right to opt out. But also, it's still kind of worrisome when it's happening and you probably don't know it. So I'd like to move on. Samir, I want to bring you back in because you have such great data. We went over the kind of millennials as workers. You also have some good data. I think is a good conversation starter for the panel here. I'm not sure if it's easier to see that screen or this one, but at a high level, you looked at really just kind of what are the penetration rates from a consumer perspective, and how's that skewing vertically?
Right, and maybe we can just talk about the market in general.
Go for it.
Right. So when we are looking at the market and trying to map the market today, we are looking at about a 15 billion market size of online or shared economy companies, businesses. And that's about 6% of the total accessible market, which includes traditional companies like car rental companies and such. When you look at 2025, that number jumps from 15 billion to 335 billion. And that's about 50% of the overall market size. So there's going to be a tremendous growth out there. And then as we look at the verticals, some of the verticals over here which talks about this is the total US adult population who is engaged in sharing economy. You can see the different verticals, entertainment and media being the largest and retail being the smallest. Now, interestingly enough, if you kind of think of the market going from 15 billion to 335 billion, the most significant growth that we are seeing in there is in the financial services, the peer-to-peer lending and crowdfunding space. The next is online staffing space. So there's a lot of growth coming in that area. There's, of course, growth in the accommodations and car ride sharing, but it almost shows that this is not a true picture of the growth that's going to come in the future. The other points over here are just, who is more involved. We kind of show it's the younger folks, the people who are not necessarily, spending a whole lot of money, and the household income seems to be in the kind of a middle class range. Now, of course, you got to bear in mind this is U.S. wide and not necessarily Bay Area, because these numbers may not necessarily represent that. And then also you're seeing that folks with kids and younger folks. So as you transition from millennials to the Gen X, you can see more of that adoption as well.
Interesting. A few more data points you have here, and also before you do this, I'll signal the audience. We have a few more minutes. Please keep talking, but I'll signal the audience if there are any audience questions. Please raise your hand. We'd like to allow some of them if there are some. And do we have a mic that can be used, or you can? We're in a small enough room. You can probably shout it out. But if you have a question, please raise your hand. Go ahead, Samir.
Sure, and again, this information will be accessible to you. I'll give you a link to it. But I won't go through all of these, but you can see clearly high percentages around affordability, convenience, good for environment because you kind of reuse the same item over multiple times. There's more community feeling. And the point which I would like to actually bring up is the last one over here is 89% agree it's based on trust between providers and users. But interesting enough, and if we kind of go to the next slide, I think it talks about the bottom right, 69% actually have an issue with that because they think that they will not trust sharing economy until it's recommended by someone they trust. So it's like there's an interesting gap of they believe trust is important, but they don't quite trust it. So it's a very interesting dynamic that we are seeing in here.
Sure, and trust also can be a function of a feedback loop of using it over time, a given app. Like the third time I use Uber, I might trust it more than the first time. Sorry to keep using Uber as an example. I guess it's one everyone's familiar with.
That's
the third time I use
important.
Hotel Tonight, I will trust it more than the first time.
But to the point that we were talking about earlier, right? If you don't feel comfortable around privacy, it is interesting. You almost get shut out of some of these economies because I tried using one of the companies in the space for the first time, and they said, "Oh yeah, absolutely, we would like to do that, but we would like to authenticate you. Do you have a LinkedIn, Facebook, any other profiles? Otherwise, sorry, we won't give you this," right? So it is interesting that it's almost like a gatekeeping item to get involved in this economy.
Interesting. Brendan, you've been quiet. I know you have a lot of opinions on a lot of this.
Just to pick up on what Samir said, like authentication is critical, right? In a marketplace, you need to have trust, and you need to see what that trust looks like on both sides. That's part of the reason why, with my neighbor, there's a shared interest in a community that's pre-existing, right?
Absolutely.
And so we're obviously leveraging that, but one of these gating things is like, are you in the neighborhood or not? And then how do you validate that? And so services like Airbnb, as you mentioned, Samir, they use your already established social reputation, if you will, as one of the ways to communicate how trustworthy somebody is. So there is a bit of a give and take, right? And those people that want to not share that information may not be able to participate in the economy at the same level of liquidity as other people. I think it's important.
You do see in a lot of these marketplaces they're self-enforced by user feedback. Airbnb is probably a classic example.
Yeah, I mean eBay early on was actually a great example, right, with the power sellers, et cetera. But this reciprocity of reputation, especially in a neighborhood, by the way, is extremely important.
Oh,
right?
sure.
So you're going to see the people around the corner, down at the local grocery store and things like that. So sometimes reviews isn't the best way. We tend to think more about behavioral-based reputation systems. Yeah. Like, are they responsive? Do they return information in a reasonable amount of time?
Sure.
And those types of things. Because, you may not want to give somebody across the street a 1-star rating.
Oh, absolutely. And people in rural areas are a lot more civil, according to Mike Huckabee. Sir.
All right, so I haven't heard anybody mention the value that a user, consumer gets from these services, and that they expect to give something back, this data that everyone's all freaked out about, that many of these consumers feel doesn't get this value. I'm going to give some of this data. I mean, I certainly, if I'm in a Safeway and they ask me for my card,
it's a good example.
I get my discount. I expect my discount.
Yeah. It's probably a personal comfort issue, like we said earlier, but that's a great example. You guys have any thoughts about that trade-off?
I mean, just in our service, it's a pretty obvious trade-off for most people is you're borrowing something at generally a lower cost than it would to a traditional retail exchange. So that's the number one reason people use a service like ours. In the initial feedback, we've only launched recently. But as I look at Samir's high points here, essentially every one of those is a reason that people want to participate in My Neighbor. They like the idea of building community and the reciprocity of that reputation, being able to be a participant in that. And also there's a byproduct. You end up meeting your neighbor, which is a really fascinating secondary value proposition for us. We didn't start out to build a social network, and I wouldn't say that we are, but it's very fascinating when two people get together and solve a real world problem. There's quite a bit of social equity associated with that.
Sorry,
I would just say transparency. So going back to the concept of the double-sided coin of trust, on one side you give up your data, and then on the other side somebody else can see your data. So you can go out and say whoever you are on your LinkedIn profile, but the internet data might say a different thing about you. You can write a cover letter to somebody saying, oh, please trust me, I'm great, and then that person can go out to the internet and find maybe a review about you that says the opposite. So it's about algorithms, to use those to help guide people to navigate that data, and that's where it gets into unstructured data, because most of that is data stored in text, and that's why natural language processing is going to be so important for this.
That's a great point. So last question for you, sir.
The question for Samir, your largest segment of the sharing economy, you showed the entertainment and media. What are the products and services that are in there considered part of the sharing?
So that would be, YouTube. It would be, Netflix. Some of those, the content sharing economy out there, as well as you think of, I would say the games that get shared. It's a whole gamut. That's probably the widest of all of them, and has probably been the longest around. But it's not necessarily the one with the highest growth. What's that?
Or legal.
That's
Becoming more legal.
Yeah.
So we're about out of time, but how about last words from each of you guys? Any thoughts that you have or didn't get a chance to say? Twitter length answers, please. Why don't we start down on your end, Amanda?
Sure. I'm excited to see where we are in 5 years, Samir. Good ideas.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I would say from a challenge perspective for this sector really is going to be trust and regulation. I know we didn't talk a whole lot about regulation. That's a big issue.
Yep.
But what is going to also be interesting is part of the equation is how do we solve the reputation and the feedback of the people that are participating, because that builds the trust. So that's
absolutely. Mary.
I just wanted to add a little something onto what Mark asked about, which is, it's one thing to have a relationship between you and the first second party relationship. I think it's the third party piece that gets really messy.
Yeah.
And so if markets are conversations, which I do believe that that's true, when we go to the store and we pay some money, we know what the cost is, right? The price is there and we pay the money and we get a good for that. The problem with what's happening with our digital data is that there isn't a conversation.
That's correct.
We're paying some kind of data, we don't really know what,
There you go.
and we're not active in the conversation around that. So I actually think in the next 5 years what will be very interesting is as things turn and there are more companies providing things where that conversation is explicit and transparent, there's an opportunity actually to best companies that are not doing that, right? So if you're making explicit how much data and what's it going to be used for, then you're going to do better as a company than companies that don't do that try to hide it and slip it out from underneath the customer.
So that's interesting. It becomes a point of differentiation. So
I think it will be,
in addition to
that.
altruistic reasons, there are business reasons for doing it. So that's an interesting point. Brendan, last words.
Next time you think about buying something, think about borrowing. I really actually think that we're looking at the next generation of consumption. Traditionally, people bought things new. They've been buying used things for the last 2 to 3 decades at high volumes. And borrowing is really the new form of consumption, and it's going to emerge into many different industries.
Sarah?
Watch out for Amazon services. If I was a small company, like many of you guys out in the audience are, today, I would look into Amazon services and try to find innovative ways that you can stay relevant and compete. I just noticed a calculator that Amazon Services has for hanging TVs on your wall, and someone will come out and install them for you. So just trying to think of these solutions that people might want to make yourself relevant and stand out.
And there's rumors of Google Home Services as well. So in terms of incumbents moving in, scary concepts, that I would add that. But thank you, that's very interesting. Bill, I guess you get the final word.
Well, as you are working with all these services online, if you're not paying for them, you're not the user. You're the product. So I agree with Mary that I think going forward, it's the transparency between users and products that's going to make the difference in companies.
I love ending on an existential note. So join me in thanking the panel.